The following 3 true Alaska horror stories are inspired by real events that reveal a terrifying truth. In the vast emptiness of the last frontier, the most dangerous predator isn't an animal. You'll hear the harrowing experiences of a detective, a mother, and a pilot who learned this firsthand. We'll begin with an investigator who stumbles upon a chilling collection of frozen bodies, the meticulous work of a killer known only as the Archivist. Then, we follow the mystery of 2 young brothers who vanish from their backyard on a winter afternoon, leaving behind only a single toy and a series of impossible clues. Finally, we witness the disappearance of a lifeline bush pilot whose plane is simply erased from the sky, swallowed whole by an unending silent void. The most terrifying sound in the world isn't a scream. It's the absolute silence that follows it. Subscribe and turn on all notifications so you don't miss what's coming for you next. It was the early 1960s, not long after Alaska got its statehood, and the service road was still garbage. Ruts and sharp rocks fought the tires the whole way up. The patrol car shook, a constant metal-on-metal rattle that made your teeth ache. Beside Detective Gabe, Officer Cole had a death grip on the dashboard. They were a long way from Juneau, chasing a tip from a local named Gary, a guy more known for stories than the truth. He'd rambled about a remote logging cabin deep in the Tongass, and something he called a collection of ice. The chief had scoffed, but Gabe couldn't shake it. He'd spent too many nights staring at the water-stained file for the Juneau 7. That case was a ghost that haunted the whole department. It was old, spanning back to the late 40s. 7 people from town, just gone. Vanished over about 15 years. The file was a brick of yellowed paper, dead ends, and notes from cops who had long since retired. As an outsider, Gabe felt the weight of it. Obsessing over the town's coldest case felt like pointing a finger at the department for letting it go dormant. It was a wound that never healed right. The road finally gave up and dumped them into a small clearing. The cabin stood there against the snow, dark and quiet, but it wasn't the dilapidated shack they expected. It was clean, sterile even. The locks were the first thing that felt wrong. Brand new, industrial-grade steel, the kind you'd see on a fishery, bolted right onto the old, decaying wood. The silence was absolute until Gabe put the key in the lock. The scrape of metal was loud and sharp in the cold air. The air inside was stale and freezing, smelling of old wood and something clinical, metallic. The place was organized with a chilling precision. Every tool, every box was in its place. Against the back wall stood 3 massive, chest-high freezers. A low, steady mechanical noise came from them, a constant cycling of their compressors. Gabe felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He looked at Cole, who was already pale. "Get Doc Sato on the radio," Gabe said, his voice barely a whisper. He went to the first freezer. The lid was heavy, and the hinges let out a long, loud screech as he forced it open. A blast of frigid air rushed out, smelling of chemicals. It wasn't a bloody mess. It was something far worse. There was a body inside, perfectly preserved, almost like a statue of flesh and bone. The other 2 freezers held the same. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was the work of a scientist, a collector. This was an archive. Dr. Sato was a tough woman, but even she was shaken when she arrived. She confirmed their worst fears. Whoever did this had specialized knowledge. The remains were stored at a constant, exact temperature, the internal organs surgically removed. But then she laid out the real problem. She ran a gloved finger along the clean edge of the freezer. "There's nothing here, Gabe," she said, her voice flat. "No smudges, no fibers, no stray hairs. Nothing." We can run prints against what's in the state file, but you know as well as I do what a long shot that is. Whoever did this was a ghost before he even started. The real blow came later, back at the lab. While some remains were decades old, analysis confirmed the most recent victim had been placed in the freezer within the last 3 months. The cold case had just turned into a hot pursuit, and it hit a wall immediately. The freezer and tools were leased under a sophisticated alias, a paper trail that ended in blank forms and forged signatures. The only clues were a collection of meticulously handwritten files, notebooks and ledgers, all in the same flowing, artistic script. The killer had left behind a confession, not in words, but in code. Gabe buried himself in those files. The pages weren't a diary of a killer. They were the cold, detached notes of a scientist. They detailed the criteria for selecting victims, a fascination with purity and stillness. The killer didn't want to cause pain. They wanted to achieve a perfect, permanent preservation. He saw his work as mimicking the power of the glacier itself. He had a name for his project, written in his private journals: the Archivist. As Gabe studied the logbooks, he noticed a recurring pattern. The notes weren't just about the victims. They were full of cryptic references to logistics and commercial fishing operations. The handwriting was a secret language of cold. One entry in particular caught his eye, a coded map reference, drawn with the same meticulous care as the rest of the notes. It pointed high into the mountains above Juneau, to a part of the Mendenhall Glacier no one ever visited, an old unstable ice cave system near a decommissioned mine. Gabe realized with a jolt that the location wasn't a second archive. It was the Archivist's final destination. He knew he had to go alone. Chief Reed scoffed at the idea, refusing to risk a full team in such unstable terrain for a phantom from a crazy man's diary. So Gabe took a snowmobile, with only the whine of the motor for company. He followed the map, the biting wind whipping at his face, the sheer immensity of the ice and rock of the mountains towering around him. The entrance to the old mine was a dark maw in the side of the mountain. Inside, the sound of his boots crunched on the ice, the noise echoing in the silent cavern. He followed faint signs of recent movement, finding a makeshift camp with specialized preservation supplies and a small, recently emptied freezer. The archivist had been here, and he had just left. He reached the end of the cave, a vast, echoing chamber. There was no struggle, no body, no final confrontation. The archivist was gone, but on a small, perfectly flat rock, a note was left behind. It was a single sheet of paper, a philosophical monologue about achieving perfection in the pure glacial zero. The writing was the same as the journals. Gabe stood alone in the cold. He wasn't there for a capture. He was there for a lesson. The archivist hadn't been defeated. They had simply achieved their ultimate act of preservation, escaping the chaos of life and identity. The vast, brutal environment of Alaska itself was their accomplice, a silent guardian that allowed them to become a ghost, forever unidentifiable and free, thanks to the limitations of a 1960s investigation. The final victim was recovered, and the Juneau 7 case was officially closed by deduction. But the law had failed to provide justice. The gaping, empty space in the cabin where the freezers once stood was a constant reminder. Gabe was left with the terrible, unending knowledge that the archivist was still out there, a phantom of the cold, and that the beautiful, silent, and unforgiving land of Alaska could still harbor decades of silent, perfect horror. Cold is just a word until you felt it in the Talkeetna wilderness. Out there in the winter of '83, it was a different kind of animal. It wasn't the wet cold that gets in your coat. It was a dry, heavy cold that pressed down on everything. It found the smallest gaps in your gear and sank right into your bones. On December 26th, the day after Christmas, that cold was in charge. By the time the sheriff got his boots on the ground, a few local volunteers were already there, their breath puffing out in white clouds. Headlamps cut beams through the gray afternoon light, making the shadows of the tall pines dance and stretch. The air was dead still. Every sound was sharp and loud. You could hear the snow crunching underfoot from 50 yards away. You could hear the quiet, worried talking between the men. And you could hear a mother calling out for her children, her voice cracking in the freezing air. "Daniel!" "Bobby!" Betty stood on the cabin porch, pulling a thin jacket tight around herself. She wasn't shaking from the cold, but from something deeper. Her two boys, Daniel, who was 7, and Bobby, just 5, had been playing by the woodpile. That was around noon. She'd gone inside just for a minute, she told the sheriff. A minute to put a few plates away. When she looked back out the window, the little clearing was empty. At first, you tell yourself a simple story. You tell yourself they're chasing a rabbit, or they're making a snow fort just inside the trees. You tell yourself they'll be back any second, cheeks bright red from the cold, complaining that they're hungry. But that simple story starts to fall apart fast. A minute passes, then another. The quiet outside the window stops being peaceful and starts getting loud. Betty told the sheriff about the last thing she heard. It was a bark, not a wolf howl, not the sound of some wild thing. She was clear on that. It was one sharp bark, like from a dog. The sound was close, right outside. The sheriff just listened, his face hard to read. He knew the area like the back of his hand. There were no dogs out here. The closest neighbor was an old trapper named William, miles down the road, and he didn't keep any animals. But Betty was sure of it. A single bark. The first search party spread out. They moved through the trees, their lights sweeping back and forth. A light snow had started falling right after Betty made the call. It wasn't much, but it was enough to smudge out any tracks the boys might have left. It was like the woods were trying to cover something up. They brought in a scent dog, a good one, but the snow was wet and heavy. After a couple of hours of the dog whining and circling, it lost the trail for good. The woods just went quiet again, except for the pop and groan of frozen tree branches. When the sun went down, the sky turned a dark, ugly color, and the temperature dropped hard. The sheriff had to make the call. The search was over for the night. It was a terrible thing to have to say, but it was the truth. It was too cold, too dark. No one said it out loud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. No kid, no matter how tough, was going to make it through a night like this one. They started again the next morning, as soon as there was enough light to see. It was a grim, quiet search. Nobody expected to find the boys alive anymore. They were just hoping to find them. A volunteer was working his way along a frozen creek, about 100 feet from the back of the cabin. He saw a little speck of color against the dirty ice. He knelt and used his glove to brush away the snow. It was a small, red wooden train car, Bobby's favorite. It was stuck in the ice like it had been dropped there and the water had frozen up right around it. That little toy changed everything. It didn't make any sense. Why would two little kids wander off to a creek in weather like this? Why would they leave the safety of the cabin to play by freezing water? There were no other tracks, no signs of a struggle. It was just there. The toy wasn't tossed on the ground. It was set, almost like a marker. Later that day, the sheriff went to talk to William the trapper. William wasn't much of a talker, but he told the sheriff what he'd seen. The day the boys went missing, around noon, He was out near the access road collecting firewood. He'd seen a truck parked by the edge of the woods, a dark blue one. It was just sitting there with the engine running low. He figured it was a hunter. He watched it for maybe 10 minutes before it just pulled away and drove off down the road. He never saw who was inside. Just a dark blue truck that had no reason to be there, sitting and waiting in the middle of nowhere. The official file on Daniel and Bobby is still open. It's a thick folder full of reports that don't add up and questions that can't be answered. When people talk about it, they always end up in one of two places. The first idea is that the wilderness took them, that the boys wandered off, maybe chasing that sound Betty heard, and fell through the ice on the creek. The current could have pulled them under in seconds. It happens. It's a clean, tragic explanation, but it doesn't explain the dog bark. It doesn't explain why there were no signs of them breaking through the ice. And it sure as hell doesn't explain a blue truck watching from the trees. The second idea is that someone took them. Someone used a dog to lure them away from the cabin, put them in that truck, and just drove away. It's a darker thought, a harder one to live with. But what about the train car? Why leave it behind? Was it a mistake, dropped in a hurry? Or was it left there on purpose, a clue that only confused things more? The truth is, nobody knows. The Talkeetna wilderness is a vast, empty place that's good at keeping secrets. It swallowed those two little boys whole and left nothing behind but a ghost story. A story made of a dog that wasn't there, a truck that no one saw up close, and a little red toy train, frozen in the ice. And some questions are scarier when they don't have answers. You hear stories about Alaska, most of them about gold or bears. But the real monster up here isn't something with teeth. It's the quiet, the emptiness. People who know it, they call it the white silence. And back in 1924, it swallowed a man whole. His name was Clive. In the Alaskan territory back then, Clive was more important than any politician. He was a bush pilot, and his little biplane, just wood and cloth really, was the only thing connecting folks in the Yukon Flats to the rest of the world. He flew in the mail, medicine, tools, whatever people needed to survive out in the middle of nowhere. He wasn't a hero from a book. He was the guy who got the job done, flying through weather that would make a bird walk. For the people out there, the sound of his engine was the sound of hope. It meant they weren't completely alone. June 14th started like any other day. The sky over Fairbanks was clear and blue, the air so crisp it felt good to breathe. It was a perfect day for a mail run. Clive loaded up, gave a nod to the ground crew, and probably thought about the hot meal waiting for him at the other end. The flight was short, a trip he'd made more times than he could count. The engine sounded strong as he took off, cutting a line across the sky. Below him, the Yukon Flats spread out like a giant green and brown map of nowhere. It looked peaceful from up there, but it wasn't. Back in Fairbanks, the radio operator had his headset on, waiting. He was used to the routine, the crackle of the radio, Clive's voice checking in. But the time for the check-in came and went. The operator tapped his equipment, checked his connections. Nothing. The airwaves were empty. It was a heavy kind of quiet, the kind that means something's wrong. Miles away, at the tiny outpost Clive was heading for, the dispatcher paced. He kept looking at the clock on the wall, its ticking the only sound in the room. An hour passed, then 2. The silence from both ends of the flight path told the same story. Clive was gone. A cold feeling spread across the territory. It wasn't just a plane that was missing, it was a lifeline. It was a punch in the gut to everyone who thought they were starting to tame that wild country. The search started almost immediately. It was the biggest one Alaska had ever seen. They pulled out all the stops. 3 of the best men they had were sent out. Vance, an old-timer who knew the sky better than his own face, took his plane up. He flew low, his eyes burning from staring at the endless green below, looking for any color that didn't belong. The silver of a wing, the white of a man's shirt. Down on the water, a man named Hansen and another named Nathan took a small boat with a sputtering motor. They pushed their way through the tangled swamps and creeks, the sound of their little engine getting eaten up by the quiet. The air was filled with the noise of searching planes for a while, a sad buzz over a landscape that didn't seem to care. Everyone who could help did. They were looking for one of their own, but they were looking in the wrong place. The enemy wasn't a busted engine or a sudden storm. It was the land itself, the white silence. It's hard to explain if you haven't felt it. It's the size of the place, the sheer, crushing indifference of it all. You realize that the wilderness is so big, the swamp so thick, and the trees so dense that it could swallow an army and not leave a single boot behind. The horror of it all started to sink in for the search parties. They weren't just looking for a man. They were fighting the landscape, and the landscape doesn't lose. It's a silent partner in every disappearance, the kind that wipes away all the evidence without making a sound. Days bled into weeks. The hope started to run thin. Vance, Hansen, and Nathan found nothing. Not a scrap of metal, not a shred of cloth, not an oil slick on the water. It was as if Clive's plane had simply dissolved in midair. The summer rains and the thick bog had done their job. It was a perfect vanishing act. The plane and the man inside it were just erased, wiped off the map like they were never there at all. Eventually, you have to call it. The search was officially abandoned. The sound of the planes faded, and the Yukon Flats went back to its usual, unnerving quiet. Alaska had to accept it. Clive, the man who flew above it all, had been taken by the very thing he challenged every day. But that's not where the story ends. When you can't find a body, you create a ghost. Clive's disappearance became a permanent legend. Other pilots started talking, you know how it is. They'd talk in hushed tones about seeing a spectral plane on foggy mornings, a silver flicker in the clouds where nothing should be. It became a warning, a story told to new pilots to remind them not to get too cocky. Clive's ghost became a reminder that no matter how good you are, the land always gets the last word. And in a strange way, his ghost saved lives. Because they found nothing, they had to figure out why. The whole mess forced the territory to create new rules, mandatory radio check-ins, better weather reports. Clive's tragedy became the first bloody lesson in the book of Alaskan aviation safety. The message was simple: you don't mess with the white silence. So even today, when pilots fly over that vast emptiness, they think of him. And sometimes, in the dead of winter, when the cold makes the air stand still and the whole world is just a sheet of white, they say you can almost hear it. A faint, faraway engine sound, a final echo of Clive's plane, forever lost in that unending, awful quiet.